then too bad for you, but we're recording all of these things. We're actually recording all of the presentations, so there will be opportunities to review and see what you've already seen and talk to your friends and so forth. Yesterday we learned anyone can sing, and last night we learned that everyone not only can do art, but they do it every day, whether they know it or not. We also learned that music has a huge variety of effects, sometimes surprising and not always good. And we proved all of that, particularly the fact that everyone should and has participated, because we had a wonderful group of school children here about this time yesterday from Denver who were improvising before our very eyes and ears, and it was really fun. This morning is going to be equally exciting, I think. Oh, and we also, of course, learned that the brain is involved in all of this, whether it wants to be or not. The next group of keynoters, we have everybody this morning is getting that designation, but I shouldn't imply that these are not very special folks. Professors CALDWELL and PAYTON, sitting here in front of you, I had the great pleasure of meeting and hearing speak this past summer at a wonderful conference on the Black spirituals called REAP, which stands for Research, Education, Activism, and Performance. This was a wonderful first-time event for a long-term organization in Denver. It's very close. Those of you who are from the area, I highly recommend you go and become a member and send in your, your checks and your credit card numbers to this organization. The Spirituals Project, kind of created and sustained by a wonderful Denver psychology professor, actually, Arthur Jones. And anyway, I heard the presentation that, or a presentation that these three brilliant researchers did, and I immediately thought to myself, this is exactly what I want as the keynote for my conference. And I was so thrilled to find that not only did Melinda Connor know Don Campbell, this couldn't be a better situation. So I'm, again, thrilled to have them here. You can read the biographies as they are printed in your program, but I don't want to take any more time from what our professors are going to tell us this morning. Thank you.
Diaspora, and specifically the Afro-Atlantic diaspora. I was sold, kidnapped from my homeland, sold to the peculiar institution of enslavement, raped by the plantation owner, impregnated by the overseer, and then they stole my children away, Lord. They stole my children away. They stole my children away, Lord. I wish I'd never been born. So I was born, and I'm still standing in spite of it all. Part of the group of people who are still standing in spite of it all. And somehow we are able to persevere. We blended our African traditional religions and our African philosophical practices with the emerging religion of the West. The African slave became part of the group that used the vocabulary of religion to build a unique body of song, the spiritual. And I want to be sure that you have a clear definition of the spiritual, because it's a word that is somewhat confusing, because it is in reference to an omnibus term, okay? It is specifically an omnibus term that speaks to an enduring body of communal music, music that was created by the group. Okay? It's a rich, rich repertoire that includes sorrow songs, like the one I just got finished sorrowfully singing, right? Shouts, work songs, field hollers, signal songs, escape songs, jubilees, game songs, teaching songs, okay? A variety of different types of songs, all called the spiritual. Okay? Because it is a song that is, because it is a song, okay, it is both musical sound and words. Okay? Consequently, there are many ways to look at the repertoire. Okay? The university perspective emerges from the university disciplines. And so it is the music of theology, right? The music of sociology, as we try to figure out what it's talking about as it teaches. Okay? It is the music of anthropology, right? The music of philosophy, the music of political science, okay? And all of the individual disciplines talk about it differently. Okay? It is the music of musicology, and it is the music of ethnomusicology. Okay? As the music of musicology, okay, we can take a look specifically at the 8 characteristics of the music, okay, that are shared amongst this repertoire. Okay? And before we get there, I want us to get a feeling for those characteristics as we hum. Do it again. Again. It's the music of dance. Now put the words on it. Wade in the water. Again. Wade in the water. And you keep shuffling along. Wade in the water. Again. Wade in the water. And you're in the water, right? Wade. And you're about to be baptized. Right? Wade. Or you're walking along beside the river because you're about to escape. Wade in the water. Now go to the next phrase. Wade in the water, children. Wade. Come down. In the water. God's gonna trouble the water. He's gonna trouble, and God's gonna trouble the water. And he's gonna trouble it, so he's gonna get rid of your smell. Gonna trouble the water. So they can't catch you. As you look at that song, right, you can hear call and response, right, because usually there was a leader who would start, and then the group with them, the workers or the congregation would come along and join, because they will have heard it and they've retained it. So you have that call and response feeling there. You have the improvisation that is a part of this ring shout, right? As the person that is leading it, wade in the water, I'm saying wade. You add words, you add melody in it. You tell a story. Hear those troops so, see those people all dressed in red, right? And you make up the story. God, and you answer, God's gonna trouble the water, right? So you have that call and response and improvisation that happens. You have a strophic structure, typically, right? Because there's somewhat, they're a blending of the hymn structure. And so the verses are strophic and they are repeated in that way. They're also often ABA, verse, chorus, verse, okay? And then they very frequently have that down-flowing melody, right? Oh, how come me? God's gonna trouble the water. That falling melody that brings out and reaches into the soul as it affirms the fact that you're falling in some way, right? The frequent use of the downward melodic line, the fourth characteristic. The fifth characteristic, the use of rhythmic complexity and syncopation, particularly with the upbeat tempos of jubilees. And so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, in the water, right? That offbeat feeling in these songs is very often the case that and what happens in the ring shout, of course, is you started at at that tempo, and you would start going and you keep going. The ring shout, you keep moving, and you get faster and moving and faster along those lines as that happens, you become transformed, right? Because this is the music of transformation, very much so. The creation of the percussive use of the body, right? All parts of the body. Banging on yourself as you create a beat, right? Banging on your, as Bobby McFerrin often does, banging on his cheeks, right? Using your tongue to click a sound. All sorts of things were used. At the same time that the enslavers were saying you cannot use percussion, they were finding ways to use their body as percussion. Embracing the physical movement, right? So that you don't just stand still as you sing. You coordinate work, that's why it's a work song very often, right? The movement of work. And the affirmation of pitch, harmonic, and timbre flexibility, right? The pitch, the Baroque structure, the diatonic scale, right? And the popularity of the pentatonic, both the pentatonic scale and the microtonal scale, very much so, as they sang in between the half tones. Wade in the water, wade in the water too. So you sort of slide into those sounds, and it really, as you slide into the tones, you slide into the person's soul. So those are characteristics that wherever there was a critical mass of African people, there was a ring shout, and there was a musical practice that used those 8 characteristics, very much so. Okay. At any rate, as I said, it was the music of this is the music of transformation. Okay? And so that in addition to being transformed for political purposes, right? Being transformed for religious purposes, It is also a healing music that has therefore opened the interest of those who are interested in brain research. Okay. I should say that how we got into this, to begin with, was that Professor Caldwell and I are involved in a music project in Los Angeles that is designed to revive the Negro spiritual. And so one of the things we did, I found myself at the ISIM meeting in Colorado some years ago, where I was introduced to Dr. Melinda Connor. And at the ISIM convention, people were talking about this emotional freedom technique. And the military and intelligence people were all over this convention. They were talking about emotional freedom. And so I got back to LA and I called Dr. Connor and said, hey, can we involve some of that tapping stuff into our spirituals project? We could blend these two techniques, which are so powerful individually, and we could really have something special. So we invited the EFT people in to speak at a little conference in Los Angeles. And as they were talking, my singers were looking at each other and saying to each other, we already do that. We already do that. There was nothing they were doing that we were not already doing. This is the technique of the black church. This is the technique of the ring shot. It's been around forever, centuries, centuries. And it's worked. We know it works because we're still here. And so we asked ourselves this question, how did we already know what we already knew? Because to think that our historic practice could actually be cutting-edge neuroscience was real news for our community. And so we set out in two directions. One was that Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Connor started in to look at the neuroscience, and then I started, I'm a policy wonk. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a musician. I'm not a musicologist. I'm a policy wonk. And I know that when you see something this transformative with this much historical impact, there's something else going on. It's not just a bunch of slaves out in the countryside singing in their traditional ways. Something else is going on. What else was going on? So I looked into the history of the 17th century. So I'm given 7 minutes to explain what happened in the Western world. Number one thing that happened in the Western world was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment led to a great explosion of humanitarianism. I'm talking 1800s, basically. And that led to an interest in being nicer to people and animals. So the humanitarianism began to flower. Another thing that happened that was really important, it was the flip side of that, was capitalism. Large-scale mercantile capitalism that produced those enormous plantations in North America, also in South America, but I'm going to concentrate on North America. And these were the plantations that were producing the tobacco and the cotton and the sugar that were being sold to European publics that were the foundation of the prosperity of Western Europe at the very same time that the middle classes that were being powered by the money and by the freedom were challenging the monarchies in the name of liberty. So the slaves were actually powering Western European prosperity. Okay. Western Europeans never wanted to discuss this, but the money flow that was coming from the American plantations was enormous. This set up a tension within the United States, within North America itself, as the North Americans were talking about liberty and, we will never be slaves, vis-a-vis England at the same time that they were enslaving lots of people and dragging people out of Africa and so on. So this is a tension within the American culture right from the beginning. And what I want to point out is that the opposition to slavery started in the 1700s. right? It's the Great Awakening of 1740, and through there, when the Methodists and the Baptists came to America and were determined to convert not just the slaves, but the whites who had gone out in the wilderness by themselves without churches. And so remember, the civilization was to follow on with the Western expansion, and the Baptists and the Methodists preached equally to the slaves and to the enslavers, which was very interesting, which was the first time when the Africans had contact with a kind of official Western European Christianity. Okay. Now what happens when you get that contract is that you get access to the Bible. Well, you know, the Bible, if you read the Bible, even casually, you discover that the Bible is on the side of the losers, not the winners. You will remember that, you remember this Moses guy, remember that story, right? And Moses, he leads the enslaved out of Egypt, and it is Pharaoh's army that gets drowned. Funniest thing. So, you know, you've got to put yourself into the Bible story, and you are an enslaved African in the United States. Who do you think you are? And most importantly, which side do you think God is on? That's number one. And this liberation that occurs in Genesis is a liberation in this world, not the next world. There is nothing otherworldly about this story. This is about being given Canaan land by God, who makes it possible for you to escape your very physical enslavement at the hands of a tyrant. Second thing that happens, the second part of the story, is the Jesus story. Now the Jesus story, I mean, if you read Matthew, and the slave owners, of course, never discussed Matthew with the slaves. If you read Matthew, you discover that God is on the side of the poor and the weak. God, blessed are the poor in heart. The duty of the Christian is to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It is your highest obligation is to love your God and to treat your neighbor as yourself, to love your neighbor as yourself. The United States was the first civilization that did not acknowledge the humanity of slaves. Now, slavery had been very old, but every other culture had always acknowledged that the people who were enslaved were also people. The Americans were the first ones who, because of their devotion to liberty, had to make a distinction between the liberty for themselves and something else for those other people who were making the money for them. And so they decided that black people were not people, and so they invented racism. Racism was invented in response to the need to defend slavery beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries. There was no racism before that. Aristotle, to the contrary, notwithstanding. So what's happening is that the Western world is beginning to be dubious about the institution of slavery at the same time that its prosperity is founded in slavery. So you've got this tension within the Western world. Then something very interesting happens in America, which is that Toussaint Louverture beats Napoleon and liberates Haiti. Now, I've got to tell you, you cannot even imagine the shock wave that sent through the Western world. That is when Napoleon gave up on his North American possessions and sold Louisiana to the United States, to Jefferson. So now this was going to create a tremendous problem for the United States, which it did, which is that everyone knew already that slavery and liberty and democratic liberty were inconsistent. And they were inconsistent not simply from the point of view of the slaves, but from the point of view of what kinds of people you would create in the dominant class. Because there's a huge difference between having a nation of free people engaged in farming or, you know, or craft or whatever, free and independent people, and having a nation who trains up its young people to be tyrannical and cruel and capricious. So that the emblematic guy who you would see if you went into the South, the emblematic slaveholder wasn't necessarily the adult slave, it was the kid. It was the 12-year-old kid on his pony who was being encouraged to go out into the fields and whip the slaves with the encouragement of his dad, who was trying to raise him up to be a proper slave owner. Now that was the America that was going to be produced if Louisiana went to an all-slave economy. And so Jefferson didn't want that. Jefferson said, no, we want yeoman farmers, and they started out trying to convert basically the Scots-Irish out of the Appalachians, who had won the revolution for the Americans. They tried to bring them down and give them land, which is what the purpose of this was, and make them into yeoman farmers. They didn't have the infrastructure for that, it didn't work, and pretty soon, by 1810, the Louisiana Purchase was attracting large-scale capital. It was going to a plantation agriculture system. It was beginning to import slaves, and it was killing by the dozens. And it was about to create that nightmare of the slave nation right there under the nose of the United States that had just fought for its liberty. So there was this tension right from the beginning, but there was so much money in Louisiana. Now the other thing that was going on was that suddenly Louisiana had to import all these people. The slave trade ended officially in 1808, but there was still a trickle. There were slaves smuggled in. So Louisiana was getting its slaves mainly from the rest of the United States. So the Tidewater colonies, Virginia and Maryland, were basically running slave factories. Tobacco had exhausted their soil, and so they were growing slaves for export. And so visitors to the United States were faced with these images, the reality that you would go somewhere in Virginia and Maryland, and there would be these streams of slaves, coffles of slaves, all chained together, being marched down into the South. You have to imagine being marched, walking from North Carolina to Alabama to get the magnitude of this, driven by guys with whips. Now, this was scandalous by the emerging standards of the time. And so what happened was that the anti-slavery movement emerged. The anti-slave trade movement emerged, the anti-slavery movement emerged, and by the time the Democratic Republicans won their battle against the Federalists, and John Quincy Adams turned anti-slavery because he could see the end of this. You had a vigorous, morally superior anti-slavery movement. And this movement, incidentally, this movement is what powered and empowered the Negro spiritual. Because what the slaves had discovered was, of course, the Bible. And the slaves were singing about their emancipation, their freedom, right here in North America. And so, to get back to the EFT motif with which we began, this is a classic EFT kind of model. You know, you take the terrible thought about yourself and you swap it for a better thought about yourself, right? So the terrible thought about yourself was, you know, I'm a slave, I'm nothing but a slave, I'm never going to be anything but a slave, I'm nothing but the will of my master, you know, which is somewhat mitigated by the ring shout and the fact that you can go and you're together and get together, but nonetheless, there's no authority higher than that. But Christianity gave you a higher authority. So all of a sudden, it is, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows my sorrow. Glory, hallelujah. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down, but say, thank God I'm heavenward bound. And so the transformation in the thought about yourself, the transformation in the understanding of who you are in the universe came about as the result of this fusion of the African ring shout and the traditional African religion with the evangelical Christianity, which was provided courtesy of the Baptists and the Methodists. And assisted enormously then by the free blacks in the cities
who were in alliance with the anti-slavery movement. I mean, Frederick Douglass was the rock star of the middle of the 19th century, and the whole world aligned with the slaves in the United States. And that's what we're talking about here. Oh, Mary, Martha, don't you moan, Pharaoh's army got drowned.
There's some very interesting things that happen as part of that process. When you look at the people that were coming over and populating America at that time, you were talking about people who were the second and the third sons and daughters of Europe. They were the aristocracy of Europe that was staking a claim on more land for the family. They were going to hold the European aristocracy system, and they were going to take, for example, Ohio and subdivide it into various families from England. Well, one of the interesting things that you have neurologically in that process is you have a population which is drinking wine. And they're drinking wine pretty much every night at dinner. And it turns out that in day 21 and in day 23 of gestation, when a woman is pregnant with a child, if she has a single glass of wine, there are 128 short string variations, the ends of chromosomes that can get broken and cause developmental delays. And one of those key developmental delays within fetal alcohol syndrome is damage to the medial prefrontal cortex. It's a section in the brain that controls bullying behavior. So you have a population that may in fact be brain damaged coming over and participating in the abuse. And they don't have a proper threshold. They're not recognizing the damage that they're doing. They literally are physically incapable of perceiving it. It doesn't excuse them. It was absolutely wrong. But it's a piece of what was present. Now, fortunately, the music did amazing things. And it did things neurologically. And it starts with something really, really simple, the breath. When you breathe, you open up the blood-brain barrier. And in the brain, it actually turns out when you take a singing breath, you're taking a breath in, you pause for a second, and then you time your breath out. And then you pause for a second, and you take another breath in. And when you do that, when you take that extra breath in, that extra moment as it crosses that process, it actually gives an extra burst of oxygen. So the people who were singing were helping to protect their brains. The physical deprivation was horrendous. They didn't have the right nutrients. They didn't have the right physical space. They couldn't keep the bodies healthy. But the singing at least helped. And it began with that process of the breath. If you take a look at the picture, there are some big blood vessels there. Okay? And those vessels are part of what's bringing that oxygen to the brain, to the cortex of the brain. And it's really, really key because what happens is a second piece. And that is that the music, which came out of folk traditions and classical traditions, because the people who were taken were not necessarily the way they're portrayed in our history and our textbooks. They were the kings of tribes and the priests. They were the wisdom keepers and the herbalists and the healers that were included in the groups that were brought over. And within that was folk music that came out of those traditions. And folk music, it turns out, and there have been some lovely studies done in Finland, in Scandinavia, where it turns out that folk music builds superior brain architecture. Now that's a technical scientific term in this case, all right? Superior brain architecture. It makes your brain work better. And it makes your brain work better consistently. The back of the brain, where the cerebellum is, right in the back there, it's one of the oldest parts of the brain. And it's key in the function of cognition, It's key in the function of emotional responsiveness. It's key in discernment. It's key in intellectualism and how you're able to connect the front of the brain and the back of the brain. Well, that piece was key in that superior brain architecture. So the music and the musical roots that this music came out of allowed the brain to be better, work more efficiently, have the people be smarter and more capable. When you sing, and you sing on a regular basis, we had a lovely representation of this yesterday. You have people whose brain keeps getting stronger and more capable, more flexible because you're using more of it, so your nerve endings aren't getting pruned away. And it remaps faster because it's more flexible, because it's getting more oxygen, there's less vascular atrophy, the vessels in the brain don't stiffen. Because it's getting more oxygen and more use, you keep more nerve endings so you can make better choices and be more effective in that process. Well, when you're singing songs in a congregational setting, and when you're teaching children the music over and over again, there's a level of resilience that happens, and there's a stepwise learning integration, okay? As you do the process more over longer periods of time, there are more changes, and your brain becomes more effective, okay? It happens slowly. It happens over 20 years. So it doesn't happen just next week, everything is not all right. But when you put children in that kind of environment, there's a birthing process that takes place. Because they get comfortable with the music, there's a familiarity. They get musical training just by being present in the environment and singing the songs. So the very best legacy that could have been handed down was, and that legacy was the music, because it made everyone's brain work better.
Okay. As I said, one of the characteristics of the African spiritual was the fact that it was holistic. It was artistically holistic. It was musical sound. It was literature because of the text. So it's telling a story, and it's got a meaning behind the story. And you have to figure out what that meaning is. And then because it's a music, it also gets your body moving. So instead of the training that those of you who are music teachers have been giving your vocal students to go put your little body right there in the hub of the piano, and okay, that the African is going to move. Is going to move around the stage. I tell the story of my graduation recital in which I did the Chopin, that one. I didn't know I had done it, but I did. Sitting in the thing, I went, bum, 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 I just automatically, the body moved. It was just one of those things. So anyway, the song "Guide My Feet, Lord, While I Run This Race," right, is one of the spirituals that helped in organizing rhythm, in organizing work, but also lifted the spirit. So you look at the words, you realize that you are not here to be in vain, right? With God's help, guiding your feet, right? Which is, guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Now I believe, and you are going to do the response, so I'm starting you off. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. Guide my feet, Lord, while I run this race. For I don't want to run this race in vain. And then I improvise. I tell the story. Stand by me. Hold my hand. Keep me going, because I don't want to run this race in vain. History.
Oh, am I supposed to?
Change in perception. Ah, this is, yeah.
Here's what happens. When the slaves originally come, this is 17th century, 16th, 17th century, the whites don't see everything they do, but what they see seems like noise. It just seems like noise. You know, all that microtonal stuff and all of that polyphony and more beyond polyphony, and the fact that they respond to each other while they're all singing the same lines, so you listen to them and you know, it can sound like noise. If you're accustomed to the bel canto style, or if you are accustomed to hymn singing, where people hold a note and try to hold a note purely and make a pure chord out of it. If you want to hear an example of this kind of singing, listen to Sweet Honey in the Rock. Sweet Honey in the Rock is devoted to the preservation of rural black church singing before gospel took over. So Sweet Honey in the Rock sounds like 1940 in the rural black churches, deliberately so. But they do all of these techniques that Dr. Caldwell is talking about are on the Sweet Honey records. If you look at one called Sacred Ground in particular, it is almost an anthology. You can almost track the lecture. Okay, but what happened to Europeans was they were processing this as noise because there was just too much going on they couldn't figure out. And so they said, oh, it's barbaric, it's noise, they're running, they're talking. And
right, Europeans, you certainly don't sing while they work. I mean, just,
right, exactly. So over time, what happens is that as the slaves become Christianized, as they develop the spiritual, they acquire European-style harmony and melody and begin to be able to do it themselves while retaining all of the Africanist practices, and that produces this uniquely powerful music, which by the 1850s is beginning to be enjoyed by Europeans who think, oh my goodness. And that then accounts for the dual power of the spiritual. It is blending these two traditions. Okay, and the Europeans stop thinking of it as noise and start thinking of it as music.
Sooner or later, everybody gets a clue. So one of the key things that happens when you begin to sing this music is that your brain begins to be able to focus better. And it does some very, very nice things. So it turns out that children who have had a lot of music training, they're able to focus better because they're able to separate out different kinds of noise. And you brought up a very important point yesterday. The person who is listening and listening and listening to music to the point that it shuts down. They stop being able to separate out noise. Well, what happens is that when your brain has something else take over a job, the nerves that would do something, that would go in and say, okay, now I need to be able to focus, now I need to be able to organize myself, get pruned. You're not using them, they don't need them. So when you take away the noise which you were utilizing to distract you, that's a problem because the nerves aren't there, and then you have to remap them. So what happens instead is when you're singing the music and you're varying the music that you're singing and you're utilizing the music, different parts of the brain, depending on how you're speaking and how you're physically moving, how you're breathing, end up being used. The auditory information is really, really key. We talk about the medial prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe because they're doing the filtering. And they're looking at how the information gets from point A to point B. Now, the other piece of that filtering process is the amygdala. So you have these three things that are working together in the brain, which are saying, this is extraneous noise, I don't need to do it. But it actually turns out there's also a mix in there. If you get microtonal information, that actually increases your ability to make good judgments and to discern things. So there's a caveat in that process. And that's why varying the music, and instead of using the music as noise and as a distraction, is very, very key. There is a stepwise modulation in the ability of the brain to learn, and the ability of the brain to learn the correct techniques to function well. And the more musical training that you have over the period of time, the better it works. And working memory gets stronger, focus gets stronger, and the whole frontal temporal network, this section from here forward, okay, in the brain, ends up being able to work together more cohesively, more consistently, and functions more accurately. Now, the other piece that is very, very important in this process is rhythm, and how rhythm varies. We're going to talk about more in that. But there's an entrainment process that happens when you start to sing. And if you're singing and you're moving the way you would in the ring shout, your whole body is in that process. You're linking the body systems in that process. Well, that cognitive awareness and that link up of the entire body system allows kinesthetic memory to start to come into play. So you have more total body system that allows you to remember than you had before. Now that means that your brain can stuff more in, and it can respond faster because it has these linkages all over your body. And it can discern more things, and we'll talk again about that more in a minute. Those frontal lobes, those temporal lobes, the integration and the discernment process become critical in the way the body is thinking about the process and integrating working memory back into your physical tissue structure.
Oh, freedom. I have an outline that shows how these songs actually got preserved down to 2013, which is where we are. And one of the things that happened was that during the days of the Civil War, the South was losing. The North was losing, I'm sorry. The North was losing. And there was real need to add fighters. African Americans wanted to be in the battle. And so they were welcomed finally into the battle. And so that they're right around 1863 or so on, there was the beginning development. These songs had been being used politically, right? Up till then, as they used them to justify the anti-slavery movement, to talk about, to show how the humanity of the people. This is a musical expression that shows your humanity. But then they welcomed Africans into the soldiers grouping. And there were these regiments of Africans. And there are writings that talk about what went on within those regiments. And in